Tell us about yourself, and then just boil it down for people what you witnessed.
Well, when I was ordained as a United Church minister, now the United Church is the largest Protestant church in Canada. It was actually set up by the government of Canada in 1925. And with the government, they jointly ran these, I don't even like to call them residential schools. They were internment camps. We know that half the children died in them, so it's a misnomer to call them schools. But when I got ordained into the United Church, one of my first postings was out on the west coast of Vancouver Island, a place called Port Alberni, which had really been the center of the whole missionary invasion that happened there in the late 1800s. And my first week on the job, I encountered Native people who began talking to me about children, friends of theirs, who had been killed in the local Alberni residential school that was run by my church at the time, the United Church. So, in a nutshell, what I did as I began to look into that, I invited people to come into the church. I had an open pulpit policy so people could get up and talk. And we began to hear more of these stories. And when I took it to the church authorities at the time, this would have been in 1992 to 94, before any of the lawsuits had begun, the church's position was basically they're all lying, they're making it up, don't listen to them. And I was warned in no uncertain terms that, I'd better stop looking into this stuff. Well, what brought things to a head was after being on the job for a couple of years, I'd swelled my congregation to about 100 people from the 20 it was when I got there. One of the things I began to find out is that there was a whole history of land theft. The churches had been, in Canada, they were given vast acreages by the government. The Crown in Canada, they claimed to own all the land. And so they parceled out native land to various churches. And these churches would then sell it off to various corporate benefactors. In this case, big logging company, including Weyerhaeuser, the American multinational logging company. They got all of this native land through the United Church. So I found out about that, and I wrote a letter about it, and I was fired within 4 weeks of doing that, without charge, without cause or notice or anything.
And it's always the same. They say, we're giving in trust all this native land to this church, which was chartered by the government. It is the government.
Yep.
So it all looks good in the press, and then as soon as people aren't looking, they hand it over to private interests, just like the phony environmental groups here in Austin stealing everybody's land, and then 2-3 years later building malls on it. So, again, this is their favorite scam. And just today I'm covering how they've got 26,000 preachers as part of a secret clergy response team, now public, who are preparing to tell the American people to go to similar camps. So they've done this over and over again. Please continue.
Well, that's the thing, Alex. That's a very important point, because in Canada especially, there is no separation of church and state. There's church and government have been working hand in glove with private interest right from the beginning. Under the guise of bringing education and quote, civilization to the native people, it was a huge land theft operation, and they have their puppet chiefs in there helping them seize the land and sign bogus treaties. The reality is that it's a history of genocide that's continuing. And I began to experience that in a real way in Port Alberni. I didn't close the door. I opened it up more and more to these survivors of this genocide. And when I wrote the letter about the land deal that had gone on between the United Church and a company called Macmillan Bloedel, which was bought up by Weyerhaeuser, when I exposed that corporate church connection, I was shown the door very quickly. But what happened in the years following that, really the church went out of their way to try to destroy my life. They went to my wife and offered to help pay for her divorce if she would leave me, which she did, and she got custody of her 2 daughters. They systematically prevented me from getting work. They blocked my doctoral degree I was studying for at the University of British Columbia because I was continuing to give a forum and a voice to survivors of the residential schools. In the year or two after I was fired, I began to get invited to gatherings in downtown Vancouver, where I'd been working for a number of years as the street minister. And people began to tell stories, survivors, of things that went way beyond the sexual and physical assault that had been reported in the media. People were describing sterilization programs, having witnessed murders, pedophile networks that are still operating in the native world involving very high-powered politicians. All of these things coming out. So we began to document this. We held a tribunal in 1998. I published 2 books about it, and finally our film on repentance, which came out a couple of years ago. And it was all, I'm pretty obviously in response to this, the government last year was forced to start acknowledging that children had died en masse, in their tens of thousands in these schools, in these death camps, really. So it's really been a process of persistence and just allowing the survivors to continue to speak and finding the documentation which supports them. I was able to find...
And it's a problem, and we'll get into that documentation, but for those that don't know, I have a stack of mainstream Canadian papers admitting that large portions of the children just died. So it's on record now, and another testament to you over more than a decade fighting and losing almost everything you had, but in the end, exposing this evil, so hopefully they can't continue carrying it out at least the level they were. And by the way, something else I didn't mention to listeners today, it's coming up later. We have been threatened by Larry Silverstein, directly by his people, to shut up. And I'm going to just say something. We're not shutting up about anything. We're committed to humanity, and I put it all in God's hands. And no matter what happens to me, no matter if people destroy me, set me up, or God forbid a bolt of lightning strikes me, I put my life in God's hands. I know you've done that, Reverend. And I just want to say, folks, we are going in against classic tyranny that is radically expanding right now. So later, I'll get more into some new developments there. So they are persecuting all of us. Get in to what they now admit was going on. And the same thing, again, is going on with the Aborigines in Australia, the same thing happening with the natives here in the United States. But now the systems they used on the natives are to be used against everyone. That's what the social services is. That's what this whole grid is. Go ahead.
Well, one of the things that I found out over the last 3 or 4 years was it was clear that there was a whole systematic campaign to target this genocide of the children. The government acknowledged last year that the death rate was between 40 and 60% every year for up to half a century, in the first half of the 20th century. This death rate didn't decrease at all. And one of the reasons it didn't is there was a plan of germ warfare, really, where they would take children who were healthy and house them in dorms where children were dying of tuberculosis and then never treating them. And the kids would be dying en masse. Now,
just like Tuskegee.
Yeah, very similar. And it was clearly a means of depopulating areas of the country that they wanted to open up to settlement, to, grabbing the resources and that kind of thing. Because these native groups still occupy very lucrative resources, the timber, the fisheries, the minerals, and the water, of course. In British Columbia, it provides a quarter of all fresh water in North America. And, this is clearly they were aiming for that reason. But what the government is saying now, they're saying, well, yeah, a lot of these children died, but it wasn't intentional. They're saying they died because of underfunding. There wasn't a malicious intent. That is totally absurd to think that a death rate can continue that long without there being an intent behind it.
And they have manuals on how to do this. Children here in the U.S. or England, they say, oh, we are doing a bad job. We need more funding. Then they get more funding, and the death expands.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's the thing. When you have a system of genocide, really, it's never turned off. The only reason it stopped in Nazi Germany is they were defeated in a war. But the perpetrators of this genocide are still in power. And that's why
Hitler in Mein Kampf thanked the eugenicist in the U.S. and England. He learned everything from the United States and was funded by the Rockefeller Foundation. That is on record, right. Mainline history.
That's right. And in fact, we found, in over the years, interviewing Native kids, it's clear that in the period after the war, under Project Paperclip, they were bringing over Nazi doctors, and a number of them were working on children in the Indian hospitals, performing various experiments and operating the sterilization programs and that. So we know that there's definitely a strong... And
that's on record. The United States, Canada, and England fought, it's in my film Endgame, fought over the eugenicist scientists because they had a large pool of German scientists and doctors who would do this, and then those Nazis trained cadres of Canadian, British, and U.S. doctors to carry it out on a mass scale.
That's right. I mean, it was really the same program on both sides of the Atlantic, and one of the differences you see in the way it happened in Canada compared to the U.S. is the churches were really at the helm of this whole thing from the beginning. There's evidence that the government tried to shut down the residential schools, but time and again the Catholic and Anglican and United Churches pressured them to keep them open right up to the 1990s.
Stay there. Let's talk about what it's metastasides into, the new crypto eugenics, how they're running that off against free humanity. We have committed to fight the darkness. If God be with us, who can stand against us?